Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Miller Center Battle Symposium. I'm Phil Potter. I'm a senior fellow here at the Miller Center. The Battle Symposium on American Diplomacy is named for the late William Battle, who served as ambassador to Australia in the Kennedy administration and had a long and distinguished career in the areas that this symposium is most interested in. He's a double who. He attended the college in 41, UVA Law School in 47, and remarkably served in the same World War II squadron as John F. Kennedy and was integral to rescuing their crew when their PT boat was destroyed. So in the right place, in the right time, but also a distinguished story of public service. We thank Bill's wife, Barry, and their family for generous support to the Miller Center on the important topics that the Battle Symposium has supported over the years. Today's important topic is reimagining nuclear deterrence. I can't think of anything that is more important or more timely given the news in recent days. It's also something, though, that a series of experts have really spent a remarkable amount of time, expertise, and frankly, just blood, sweat, and tears producing important knowledge on, and that's something that we wanted to highlight in this symposium. This has come together in large part because of the contributions of Admiral Chaz Richard, who is at the Miller Center as a Schlesinger Chair these days. He and I thought it very important to bring together both the expertise of a series of experts in this area, as well as the recent commission report. Many members of this commission are present on the panels today, and we wanted to sort of highlight their important work and then also sort of draw the next conclusions. One of the important things that we're looking to establish here are frankly a series of kind of the next questions, right? What are the important things we need to be asking? Where are the areas for academic study? Where are the places that we go in order to move the ball forward on this topic? So with no further ado, let me introduce our panel. I'll just kind of go from left to right here. Mara Rudman is our other Schlesinger Chair, second but certainly not diminished in that we don't rank order them actually here. We find that to be awkward for everyone involved. Mara's government positions have been extensive, and I should say I'm going to massively shorten each of these folks' tremendous contributions, otherwise we'll have no panel. She served as Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs in the Obama administration and the Clinton administration, an important series of roles in the Middle East as well. Mara, thanks for being here. Next over, we have Lisa Gordon-Haggerty, who is currently CEO of Wolverine Global. She served as Administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration and Undersecretary for Security at the U.S. Department of Energy at the DOE. Lisa, thanks. Next over, we have Frank Miller. Frank is a principal at the Scowcroft Group in Washington, previously served as in the White House as Special Assistant to President George Bush and as Senior Director for Defense Policy and Arms Control in the NSC. Thanks, Frank. And then finally, last but certainly not least, although significant distance away on this panel, I feel, is Rebecca Heinrichs, who's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and director of its Keystone Defense Initiative. She's commissioner on the Bipartisan Strategic Posture Commission. Thanks to all of you for being here. So no one came here to listen to me talk, so now I'm going to start asking some questions, and I really encourage sort of, again, kind of cross-talk on the panel. You all are very well known to one another, and I think one of the things we really benefit from is sort of hearing that. And I would also encourage, as questions kind of come to you in this panel and the next, put them on the white cards that you have. Those of you, the many of you who are online, feel free to put those questions into the chat. They will then make their way through a circuitous route to me, and we can put them to these good folks. So the first topic we wanted to talk about is sort of an animating feature of the current deterrence environment, the thing that sort of has everybody thinking in new ways about. I question to some extent the degree to which this is really new, but this is sort of what we call the three-body problem, right? This idea that there are now two adversaries out there where we used to sort of stylize the story and say it was the Soviet Union, it was one. Now it's Russia and China as very different types of threats, but something approaching co-equal threats, right? I know that one of the things that you've thought considerably about is that basic issue. And so I wonder about the extent to which you see these adversaries as something that really change the rules of the game, or do we have a single posture that can kind of encompass both of these things, right? And particularly what I'm honing in on here is these are really different countries, right? They are on incredibly different trajectories. Their leaders are very different people. Their institutions operate in dramatically different fashions. How does one develop kind of a single posture that is encompassing of both of those two threats? And I'll just have sort of each of you kind of go down the line on this one. So Mara, if you would lead us off, that would be fantastic.
Sure. Happy to do it and happy to be here. Thanks for having me, and nice to be reunited with Lisa and with Frank, both of whom I worked with in the Clinton administration. And I say that also just to give folks a sense of how much people who work on national security issues work largely regardless of administration. And that's true even for folks who are political appointees, as well as folks who are in career positions. I think that gets lost in a lot of the noise, certainly in current years. So it's important to emphasize, and I appreciated the chance to work with them and to be here. In terms of the question that you raised, Phil, I would say we are in a different environment. And part of the reason I look at it that way is to consider that China and Russia are not identical, as you say. But I would look at it as they have different strengths and different weaknesses, and they are both very much competitors with us, is the kindest term I think that you might use. And I come at it from, I not served on the Posture Commission, but I am currently serving on the National Defense Strategy Commission, and this obviously plays a role in that. The nuclear deterrent element and integrated deterrence clearly stated in the strategy. But the strategy leads, and this again was true under the prior administration as well as under President Biden, the last two national defense strategies, describing China as a pacing competitor. Russia's described as an acute threat. I think speaking for myself here, but I know that there's consensus among the National Defense Strategy Commissioners, and our report is months out, at least, that Russia really should be described as a chronic threat, chronic and persistent. Acute lets them off too easy, and perhaps lets us off too easy. And so that's the table setting, that we really are in a world, and have been for some time, of the great power threat. And I would say it's also a challenge to look, and this may be a little bit anathema to this discussion this morning, but I hope we get there, that we have to look really broadly when we talk about how we, the United States, protect ourselves and our national security interests from the threats that we face. And in other words, I think there's an entire continuum, frankly, and China is a great example of this, from gray zone conflict and really looking at how they position themselves to their advantage and our detriment on a range of economic issues that really do, the economic security and national security for the United States, I think need to be viewed as a whole. And lines between what perhaps in the past or more traditionally or in scholarship, foreign policy is here, defense is here, foreign policy is here, domestic policy is here. Those lines people should stop thinking in terms of. We should think in terms of the challenges that we face as a country and how we best situate ourselves to address those. And that's also why I think you see, and you see it in the nuclear posture review, you see it in the National Defense Strategy. I see it in what I hear our newest chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General C.Q. Brown, say that allies and partners are critical for helping for how we in the United States look at our national security. And so with that, I'll wrap up, and I've been talking for a while here. The reason I end on allies and partners is alliances like NATO are absolutely critical for our national security and for what our commitments mean to the other countries who we need to be shoulder to shoulder with. And that is true. So even things like what our nuclear deterrent ability is and how other people hear and rely upon us matters deeply. And knowing our NATO allies, knowing that they can rely on us matters deeply. And all of these things together, working at their best, form the ability for the United States to maintain its position in the world and to be able to most effectively deter what is absolutely a dual threat from China and Russia.
Lisa, please.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you to the Miller Center. Thank you for putting this together. And obviously, Chaz, thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be with friends and longtime colleagues, George especially. So I'm going to take off from what Mara said because she and I are in violent agreement, usually. But I did want to talk for a minute about extended deterrence and the world we're in. Obviously, I'm hoping that many of you had a chance to read the Commission report, and we did talk about obviously the two adversary threat. But again, I'm going to lead off on what Mara ended with, which is extended deterrence. And it requires us to maintain and strengthen our ability to retain those relationships with our allies and our partners. And those are obviously two very different groups of people, but we need to show we, the United States and our allies, need to show our strong extended deterrence, and because that gives us that foundation for our freedom and security. These are challenging issues these days, especially internally in the United States, because of our infrastructure, because of the things that I'm going to get at a little bit of a tactical level here now, having served in the previous administration, but 35-year plus career in federal government, in and out of government. Perception is often reality. And there are a lot of our partners and our allies that have this perception of the United States, which turns into reality. The state of our industrial base and the nuclear security enterprise, which I can speak about, obviously, warrants continued attention in the United States to assure our alliances that they're strong. When there's a void, obviously, we've seen China, the PRC, and Russia be able to fill those voids. We see the relationship that's ongoing now between Russia and the DPRK. We know of the longstanding relationship between China and DPRK. And what do those relationships mean? They're trying to fill some voids. Our adversaries and those who are obviously currently part of our alliance may feel little or no confidence in the United States about our strategic deterrent. We give them that opportunity by the way we speak about our, obviously our Minuteman III replacement, other things, Sentinel, other programs, when they really focus on what extended deterrence really means. And witness the public perception in the ROC, in the Republic of Korea right now. It's almost overwhelmingly a majority that they think they should become a nuclear weapon state. There are discussions going on about those kinds of things with their leadership. They rely on the United States for that extended deterrence. We look at allies and partners, and we want to do everything we possibly can to ensure that we retain very strong alliances. And while we're obviously strengthening our relationships in the Indo-PACOM region, we're not moving quickly enough. One of the focuses of the Strategic Posture Commission was urgency. We kept banging that drum about urgency. The United States, either perception or reality is that we're not moving quickly enough to modernize our stockpile, modernize our strategic deterrent, and also continuing to build and strengthen those relationships, both with our partners and our allies. So urgency is a priority. It's a challenge. It's what previous administrations, current administration, and future administrations will be challenged with. But we can't just speak about the executive branch, because it's not about the executive branch. One of the other things the commission did, and I don't want to focus on the commission, but those of us that have worked both in the legislative and executive branches know that turning the legislative branch around to be able to deal with these things, whether it's we're 2 palms ahead, Admiral Richard and I were talking about that last evening, we're trying to be able to make those major changes in a quick enough fashion where we can the appropriators can move monies around. It's something for another fulsome discussion, but it's something that needs to be had. I happen to be in the White House on the National Security Council staff when we stood up the Homeland Security Department. At that point, when Secretary Ridge came in, Governor Ridge, then Governor Ridge and Secretary Ridge. Just let me end with this little vignette because it's very telling, and it really speaks to the challenges that our legislative branch will have to deal with. And that was that he had 13 subcommittees, appropriation subcommittees, in which he had to testify for all of his budgets. Here we are 20 plus years with the Department of Homeland Security, and we finally in the last 7-10 years been able to extricate the small groups of authorizing subcommittees and committees, and well, sort of. Okay, so we're not there yet. It's not yet successful, but it's clearly something that we have to deal with, and we rely on the legislative branch to do just that. So we do have some leaders. We've had some vestiges of leadership, and I think we've got a new group of people coming in. But it takes a full U.S. government, a whole of government, if you will, and that doesn't just mean the executive branch. It means we have to look across the entire government in order to make these changes so that we can continue to have a robust strategic deterrent, which is extended and which shows the freedoms, it maintains the freedoms and security that the United States relies upon. So,
Thank you. No,
thank you.
That's excellent. Frank, please.
Thanks, and let me, again, thank you and Chaz for inviting me, and it's a great honor to be up here with friends and colleagues of decades, and so thank you. No one would ever confuse me for being a physicist, so I'm not going to address the three-body problem as such. Let me say that what we are now dealing with is a world which has changed dramatically over the past 15 years. And we now have to face a situation where at some point in the future, unless we're successful, we face a real aggression from either Russia or China or both. And I think this is the big intellectual sea change, which has the Commission helped stimulate. But I think as I walk around the Pentagon and talk to people, there's a realization that the possibility of individual aggression or opportunistic aggression or planned combined aggression is quite real. And this is something new to us. We have focused for a long time on a sort of a one war case and a lesser included case, and that's simply not acceptable anymore. The second thing I want to touch on is, you said, Phil, that they're very different countries, Russia and China, which is true. But I think that what still remains pretty central is that we are talking about deterring two men who are brutal autocratic dictators. And I think there is a formula for doing that, which is to threaten them to hold at risk those assets which they consider most valuable to them in the present day, and indeed after a war, things that they want to survive so that they could remain in power, controlling their country with military forces and war-sustaining industry. And it's to threaten to take all of that away in the worst instance. So I think the principles of deterrence have not changed. The principles of deterrence are sound. What I think we need to focus on is that our capabilities are not up to that dual deterrence challenge. And there's no blame or fault on that. The programs that we have in place now, whether they're at DOE or DOD, or whether they respond to the broader defense industrial base, were essentially set in 2010. When Russia was not a threat, it was some sort of a frenemy, and China wasn't even in the discussion. Well, we do not have the capabilities on a 2010 program to deal with 2024. We do not need massive investments, but we do need to change some things in all of those areas. I think that the military forces, the strategic forces, the NNSA, and the defense industrial base. So I think that's absolutely critical. And contrary to some of the mischaracterizations of the Posture Commission's report doesn't call for massive, heavy investment in the near term on nuclear forces. It talks about two conventional programs and investing in the defense industrial base and the NNSA industrial base. So again, that's where the focus is. Finally, I think I'd like to talk about an integrated policy. And since the beginning of the 2000s. We have failed, administration after administration, to have integrated policy, whether that's within the Defense Department or across the notional whole of government. And we admire the problem and we talk about it. We really are very good at admiring it. But if you think about a policy that starts with a consistent approach every day from the State Department, the intelligence community, to influence foreign populations, including those under the thumb of the Xi and Putin, to covert ops, to conventional ops, to nuclear ops, and bringing that all together. We failed to do that. I mean, it's too hard. But unless we deal with it's too hard, we approach things in a piecemeal and uncoordinated way, and that's not going to cut it. The last thing I think, two points. One is about allies. There's no question but that we are vital to allies' defense, whether it's in Europe or the Pacific. There's no question that allies are vital to our defense. And I think one of the areas that the Commission was most concerned about when it began its work, and Senator Kyle is most eloquent on this, is that we needed to reach out to the American public and to our elected representatives to make the point that America has a unique role in the world. And I fear that we really haven't done a very good job on that. The focus has been on what programs we talked about or what the timeline is. But if you look at the debate literally today on the Hill, the appreciation of allies and their role in our defense is lacking. So I hope that perhaps today and through other things that happen here at the Miller Center, an appreciation, a broader public appreciation and appreciation among our elected representatives can take place that talks to the need to support our allies for our good as well as for allies' good.
I certainly share that hope. Rebecca, please.
Sure, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you all, and just want to echo the thanks for being invited to have this discussion. It was a real privilege to be one of the commissioners on the Strategic Posture Commission. I started, my work in government began on Capitol Hill, and I left the Hill about the time that the last Strategic Posture Commission came out, and in which this program of record that they're currently operating under to modernize our current nuclear force really came out. So 2008, 2009 is really when the country decided this is the kind of nuclear modernization program we need. As Frank said, Russia was not viewed as a very serious pressing adversary in the nuclear context. The focus was really on the threat of potential nuclear terrorism. And so that has real implications on the speed at which the nuclear modernization took place, the intellectual capital that was devoted to thinking about deterring Russia, and many other practical implications. And then China, as Frank said, was not really even considered in the picture as a major nuclear power of which the United States must seek to deter. It was really a lesser included case. And so one of the major findings of the Nuclear Posture Commission now was that it can no longer be thought of as a lesser included case, that we must consider both of those countries as we think about deterring them separately and also simultaneously. And really the Commission was concerned about where those two countries were collaborating increasingly in different ways as well. I want to highlight a couple of things just about the report itself, which I think you'll find interesting. We really did have the American people in mind, the average American. How can we write this report so that the average American read it and understand it? And so we began, even before we got into the section on the threat, we backed it up and explained U.S. stakes. And so to Frank's point, there is perhaps a lack of understanding about the important role that allies play in U.S. interests, but even before that, about what is at stake. When we say the U.S.-led order, what do we mean for the average American? So we spell out those things in a little bit greater detail so people can try to get their minds around what we're talking about. Because then whenever you explain that both China and Russia, different countries, but both determined to replace the U.S.-led order, And that has real implications for Americans today and for our grandkids and great-grandkids. And so I've encouraged people, everyday Americans, to get copies. If you want copies of the report, get it. It makes a great book club book to sit around and talk about what the threats are and what's at stake. Because it really does, when you think about deterrence, it's not just about the kinds of capabilities that the country can bring to bear. It also, in order to have credible deterrence that is convincing the adversary that he should not threaten U.S. interests, that he should go down a different path, that he needs to believe that not only do you have the capabilities to put weapons on targets, but that you have the resolve to do it. You're willing to do it. We're not just going to send bombers to scare people. We might actually use those bombers. We're not just going to send a carrier. We're going to use that carrier. And so to do that, you have to have an American people who agree that those things are worth actually defending and projecting power and force to do that. And so you need the American people to understand. So that piece of resolve, the American people have to be behind us. And so that we're absolutely seeing that play out right now, that even if you have a White House that has resolve and a Pentagon that has resolve, if you don't have the American people behind you who understand what this is all about, it's very difficult to convince the adversary in a compelling way that the United States is serious about defending our core interests. So that piece is really important. And then the next point I would just say is that the report made an important conclusion that if the United States does not want to rely more on our nuclear weapons to handle both of these two countries, we are going to have to seriously invest in our conventional forces. The threat of nuclear employment becomes more real when an adversary believes, you think about what are these scenarios in which the really scary idea of a nuclear employment can actually happen. It begins in a conventional non-nuclear conflict over seemingly smaller matters that can escalate in a regional context, in a conventional context, and get to the point where an adversary considers getting closer to that nuclear precipice. So in order to stay away from that nuclear precipice, you have to have robust conventional forces. And so the report makes that point, I think, very compellingly. The other thing is, which Frank said too, we do not need to reinvent the wheel on how we do deterrence. The concept of deterrence has not changed. What's changed is the threat environment to nuclear power. So we're not thinking about, well, maybe we can perhaps deter countries by doing, by targeting things that the adversaries don't value. The worst deterrence is still very, very enduring about how we think about getting into the mind of the adversary and how we might threaten him to steer him away from going down the path of destruction towards the United States or confronting the United States. And so Frank's point on that is really important. And the Commission embraced that we should still maintain a nuclear deterrence strategy that complies with the laws of armed conflict, and that we would only target military targets that the adversaries value, and that we would not intentionally target their people, their societies as such. And that was a really important point, I think. And then the other thing I would just say is we really did try to convey a sense of urgency. So we did not make very specific recommendations on technologies or force posture. In many ways, we left that open to the planners and the Pentagon to think about how we might do that. But we did want to convey a sense of urgency that the country has to think about now. How do we get our supply chains correct? How do we get our industrial base ready and our workforce ready so that decision makers even have those options to make decisions in the next 3 to 5 years if our adversaries continue to go down this path and as China continues to grow its nuclear force, as we assess that they are certainly likely to do over the next several years. And so there is a sense of urgency that those changes do need to make place now. And then especially in the Indo-Pacific theater, we do make an urgent plea that we do need to make some changes there to convince the Chinese not to make an aggressive move against the democratic peoples of Taiwan. And so with that, I could keep going and going, but I will end it there.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm just real curious because you three are on one commission. I'm on the National Defense Strategy Commission, and Rebecca very much sees by your emphasis on urgency. So we have real votes right now in terms of urgency in front of our Congress, because certainly the money for Ukraine goes to the defense industrial base, goes to our preparation as well as to how Russia views what we're doing. So I'm curious, I know where the National Defense Strategy Commission was and is on that, even though our report isn't out yet, with a lot of conversations ongoing to try to emphasize to folks who right now have the ability to vote on this, the importance of it. So I'm curious on where you all are on that in terms of as a commission, and you talk about the American public. So I totally agree with you on the urgency of getting this message out, including to those who have these votes in front of them. So I'm curious about whether you guys talked about it, whether, it's an issue for you.
I think I could say, speaking for the commission, but projecting a bit, I think there are three tragedies playing right now. The first tragedy is the continued delay of the Congress to address this sends a message to Putin that he can just keep doing what he will, that we're broken, that we cannot coalesce around something that's important. The second tragedy is that the Ukrainians are fighting and dying, and we're not giving them the capabilities that increasingly they need to defend themselves against a brutal aggression. And the third tragedy is that we apparently are having a very hard time, not apparently, we're having a very hard time coming together on the Hill, that the old foreign policy, national security policy consensus on the Hill is shattered. And so I think it would be our view that all of these things need to be solved urgently, and they're not. But did I misspeak?
No, that's exactly right. One of the, 75% of the money in this supplemental goes directly to American workers in the United States, because it invests in the ability. So when I talk about what is the defense industrial base, I'm talking about this country's ability to produce the necessary weapons for a particular conflict at the scale and speed to bring to bear. So there is this misconception that if the United States invests, it is investing in 155 millimeter rounds and we're sending them all to Ukraine, then the United States doesn't have them. Okay, well, it's true if we send them there, that we don't have them here, but we're increasing our ability to produce those particular munitions at scale so that we can produce more for ourselves and for our allies, which, by the way, if we help our allies and we want to cover down on this particular problem so that doesn't escalate further, so that the United States doesn't have to get involved directly with a major nuclear power. So there's a misunderstanding about what we're talking about when we say that we are behind and we have a very atrophied defense industrial base. People don't really understand what that means. So Frank is exactly right about what this particular supplemental does. So there's a lot of education that needs to happen on that particular point. And then the other thing that I think is going on is a misunderstanding about the concept of escalation. So and this goes right to what's going on with Ukraine. We're seeing it play out. We want the Ukrainians to escalate to win. I mean, we want the Ukrainians to be able to escalate sufficiently, prudently, in such a way that convinces the Russians that they're not going to prevail. And so you actually have to get our allies with the necessary weapons and particular capabilities that they need in order to carry out a strategy that convinces the Russians to stand down. And I think that there's a misunderstanding right now that if the United States continues to help Ukraine, that help will cause an escalation or a provocation such that the United States will be dragged into there. So there's these two concepts that we're kind of stuck in right now. That's having the effect. And the last point I'll just say is, I actually think that there's still broad bipartisan consensus. It's just that these factions have such a on the far right and the left have such a hold that is thwarting the consensus that exists between the two major political parties. And so we are at a really tough standstill for now.
So let me pull on this thread, because I'm really struck by the extent to which, in response to a question that was structured around Russia and China, we talked about the United States, right? And as we all know, one of the pathologies of the DC foreign policy blob, as we'll affectionately call it, is that it is actually remarkably consensus-based, right? All of you have had experience in different administrations and are used to cooperating. You tend to violently agree. We tend to violently agree. There is sort of that thing that sort of happens when the work you do is so heavily driven by national interests, right? It clarifies thinking.
Shared facts.
Facts. Okay. I like that. But, and here's the sort of heavy but, we are looking at a world that is increasingly politically polarized, those end poles that you're talking about, even if that middle consensus lies there. And we're looking at a world where we're increasingly getting into sort of exotic bundlings of foreign policy issues around Israel and Ukraine, for example, a very, very different three-body problem, in order to maintain our position and what we would like to do, and what, you know, I think all of us up here think is the right thing to do. And so I'm curious, maybe Lisa, I'll sort of lead off with you on this, but are we getting to a place where the level of internal polarization we have, and particularly the extent to which parties are sort of siloing under different adversaries, is a component of this three-body problem that we're not really thinking through and probably need to? And you know, feel free to take the question in a different direction, but I think that you're all sort of honing in on something really, really important with regard to the extent to which sort of unanimity in the American mind is the underpinning of kind of all posture and deterrence.
Well, thank you, Phil. So I think I'll take your question directly, but then I'll indirectly, and I think I will pivot off of what my colleagues over here talked about with the commission report. But it is increasingly polarized, and I no longer live in the Beltway. So I have extricated myself successfully, and I'm now a resident of Florida. So in the last couple of years, I've spoken with people, communities, because my neighbors, if you will, that are outside the Washington, D.C. Beltway. And it's really quite interesting not to have even this is still inside the Beltway at UVA when you really think about it, when you look at the people that are here in the cross section. It's still a Washington mindset. But when in Florida, for example, just speaking with people, the American people, I give them more credit than, and that's not speaking down to them, it's they recognize that the ideas that we hold dear, the freedoms and the security that we have, they don't listen every day to the talking heads, if you will, but they do formulate opinions. And so I guess I'm looking at this from a different standpoint. The polarization is a bad thing. I completely agree with that. And you're either far right or far left. There's no in between, but I've seen a lot of in between. And I've seen people that recognize this. And it goes to Frank's point, and kind of all over this, but it goes to Frank's point. We really wanted to get, or perhaps Rebecca, we really wanted to get to the American public, not to educate them because they're educated enough. It's to inform them about the challenges that we are facing now and will face in the future, where we've got this polarized world, and then you lay on top of that two nuclear peers, nuclear adversaries, and that they want to take, those two nuclear adversaries want to take our freedoms away from us fundamentally and change our mindsets. And it's only a generation or perhaps two away. And how do you get them to understand that resolve and take that on themselves to say, whether it is the Ukraine issue or the Israel issue, it's broader than that. It's about our fundamental freedoms and what we hold dear, or what, more importantly, what we take for granted and what the American public takes for granted and how that's at risk. And so in that regard, there is some polarization. Florida is obviously a melting pot of left and right, but just to have the conversations with Americans, with other people like us. And so trying to extricate myself from that political sphere in which, 30 years of this, I call myself a recovering bureaucrat for a reason. I'm an American before I'm anything else. And I want our country to remain free and prosperous, but we are 1 or 2 generations away from allowing that to happen. So we need to have that strengthened, that nuclear deterrence or that strategic deterrence has to be the foundation of what we are. And to be able to inform the American public why it's so important is really what our commission wanted to do and what I try to do every single day. My husband kind of reminds me that I have to get out of this mindset. Like I said, it's that 10-step program. I think I'm probably at about step 7. But in all seriousness, there is that polarization. We need to extricate ourselves from that. We need to show by example what America really means and the strength of America and the freedoms we hold dear.
So one follow-up, and then Mara wants to get in on this as well. Should we worry that, because Rebecca and the commission in general clearly was on this public education mission, right? And I think that's incredibly important. But there is sort of a second step here, because in the end, I'm inclined to think that the folks we are trying to deter, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, are much more steeped in the fragmented political discourse than and so let me go to Rebecca with this. But what I'm asking is, how do we get that to flow up to a place where it actually has a deterrent quality? Is it in terms of consensus around capability? We're going to buy the right stuff, and therefore the capability is there. What does this look like in the view of the commission?
I think that one of the things I explain, when I give my briefing and I talk to people, and because they immediately want to, or I'm talking about Congress, different staffers, different congressmen, immediately want to go into what they're specifically worried about, what they're preferred. They're really worried about Iran, the Iran regime, or they're really worried about Russia, and then they're really worried about the American border. And there's all of these truly real, genuine, pressing security concerns. But one of the things I tell, and a lot of the things happening domestically, one of the things I tell them is all of our domestic problems will be made worse if we do not handle the external problems. So we have real and serious divisions, and we're having very serious arguments as a country over lots of things domestically. And I don't want to sort of disparage that. There's a real important conversations, but I try to convince the Americans that as important as that is, and that's very important, it will all be made worse if we cannot all agree as Americans that the U.S.-led order is worth defending, and that these are the adversaries that are the main drivers behind these shiftings and very dangerous dynamics. And so to your previous question about the different threats that groups tend to coalesce around with the ones they're most concerned about, my dream is to one day live when the United States has a grand strategy that it implements. But where you look at these, the way to do that is you look at the major powers that have the will and determination and the capabilities to carry those out. And so that's China, number one, it's Russia, and then it's the two of them collaborating. And then which other powers how do they fit within those two countries, and what are they doing in their respective regions? And so you look at Iran and North Korea. And that really is an axis, a developing axis where they're increasingly collaborating. So I tell people, if you're really concerned about Iran, you should be really interested in stopping the Iranians from the IRGC from training the Russians on their drones, which they're using against the Ukrainians. If you're really concerned about Russia, you should care that sanctions relief on the Iran regime is enabling the Iranians to fund the Russian war machine. And so you really do have to understand how those major powers are affecting things, and then how the very serious pressing threats that are more regional powers still fit into that larger puzzle. And so that's the work of the commission. I appreciate Lisa's point too. The American people, I think, are still very intuitively right about a lot of this. It's just a matter of how do we make it make sense, because they are the ones who are in charge in this country. So you really do have to convince them of how to think about this all as Americans, despite our differences domestically.
Yeah, I appreciate that keeps coming up as a theme. Mara, please.
Thanks. Yeah, I actually want to pull the threads on what Lisa was talking about in terms of we really have a whole of society challenge and a whole of society opportunity. And so I think it's a matter of, I agree with you, not education, it's conversation. And finding the means to have those conversations. Because where I'd push back on you, Phil, is I actually don't think there's a party divide on support for different countries. I think that is being, why I made the point earlier about shared facts is I think you have you have extremes. I actually don't happen to believe the extremes are equal to each other in terms of the extreme right, extreme left. But I believe that they are small factions of both where the parties are and where the American people writ large are. I think our challenge is that people do not have a shared basis of facts because they draw from very siloed media sources, which also, by the way, getting back to Russia and China, two countries adept at exploiting the very kind of vibrant democracy we have and the various ways that people get their information in ways I think that the United States is far behind. Not that that is a game that we should play, but we have, because of the ways in which we're open, because of the ways in which our media has a great deal of freedom, frankly, we have two countries, and they are not alone, also non-state actors and Iran and others know how to exploit that. And so when 1/3 of our young people get the majority of their information from TikTok, and TikTok has massive state control behind it, that is part of our challenge. And so I would not spend a lot of time thinking in terms of a particular party is in a particular place on assistance to a particular country, and more think about how are people getting their information, what are the means we can use to have conversations, and conversations in a variety of fora across the country, so that we can get to some greater shared understanding of what the facts are. That's
a really interesting point. Frank?
Yeah, first, I want to absolutely endorse everything that Mara and Lisa and Rebecca have said. Spot on. Two final additional points. One is, and it really speaks in a way to where we are today, Americans don't really learn history anymore. I mean, how many people know that because of the failure of the European system, we were twice drawn into World War I and World War II because we didn't want foreign powers dominating the European landmass or the Pacific for us. And the whole point of deterrence post-World War II is to prevent those situations from developing. So the notion that, well, the hell with them, let Putin do what he wants, is totally antithetical to our requirements for keeping the world the way it is. Piggybacking off of that and being careful, speaking to the news reports over the last 48 hours about maybe a Russian capability to put nuclear weapons in space, violating yet another treaty. I think it's the 10th treaty that the Russian government under Putin has violated. But let's assume, without speaking to what is true and not true, let's assume that's a capability. If a nuclear weapon or several weapons went off in space, it could destroy the GPS system. I can't find my way to Charlottesville Airport without Google Maps.
We'd get you there.
Your ATMs, your basic computers, the timing mechanisms, everything we depend on in terms of our modern life would be gone. And that's a fundamental threat, as you were saying. We have threats at the border, but that's a threat to everything we do right now, here, today. And the House degenerated into, well, this is some sort of a crazy ploy by Congressman Turner to deal with the FISA Act. I mean, there's a big picture there. There's a fact here that people need to grasp. And anything that we and you can do to help make those facts clear, because facts are immutable. They are not alternative facts, they are facts.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to pull on that just a little bit here. That's the other thing, is this explaining to people that when this notion of categorizing the challenges that are really up close to them versus the ones that are far away, that we can, if we ignore that and just focus inward, I'm talking about Americans not learning history, you can hear a lot of the arguments that are the same argument. They don't like to be called neo-isolationists or isolationists, but they are making the same arguments that were made before the Second World War first. And so the one thing I tell them is, because of technology as well, you can't throw up the drawbridge and look inward. You can't. When the United States is completely reliant and dependent on space assets, that we have to care about Russia anti-satellite capabilities, and the Chinese and the North Koreans are really working on those capabilities. The IRGC develops satellite systems they can put in space and counter satellite. And so that option isn't there. We don't have to go abroad looking for dragons. You've got the Russians with cruise missiles that are right there, and that can target. So the other last quick point I'd say is that this how the United States has thought for many years about keeping Americans at home safe is that we want to be able to project power and assist and aid our allies when they are at risk, and to try to keep those conflicts the lowest levels of violence possible, and to end them as quickly as possible so they do not grow. And our adversaries have adapted and are learning and thinking about that, and are really developing capabilities that could flip that. that what if they could hold the United States at risk in such a way, either at space or directly with our assets on the homeland, that could strike us in such a way that they might think would not enrage us, but would paralyze us with fear, so that we do not then decide to come to the aid of Lithuania or Estonia. Or Poland. And I mean, that might, now I think they would be wrong. I want to be clear. I think that it would enrage us and it wouldn't just frighten us. But I can't take that for granted. And so the other recommendation of the report is that we've got to thicken out our defenses. This notion that vulnerability is going to maintain stability. If it was ever true, it's certainly not true now. And that the United States has remained vulnerable in an effort, in certain ways, in an effort to maintain mutual vulnerability, to try to increase stability. But we've seen our adversaries exploit that vulnerability in such a way that now it would be destabilizing to remain vulnerable. And so that's one of the recommendations of the report, too.
No, that's excellent. And I think an important thing to pivot to, right? So you've sort of suggested thickening up defenses as one way to do this, but extended deterrence has kind of come up for multiple folks. Lisa, you brought it up with regard to Korea. They're not the only ones who are getting a little shaky on this topic. And to be perfectly frank about it, you know, we've been putting our partners and allies through the ringer recently in a variety of ways, right? And so I can't say that I think it's totally irrational if they're, you know, self-interested national actors, that they would at least be hedge. Yeah, exactly, right? And, you know, at best, put us on the good foot a little bit so that maybe we do better, and at worst maybe have to move down that pathway. And so I'm curious, given that this has been a moving target and has even evolved since the commission report, which is sort of a remarkable velocity on this, what should we be doing in concrete terms to sort of bolster our allies' confidence, our extended deterrence? Rebecca put sort of one notion on the table in terms of sort of thickening up our defenses more broadly. I would argue that that would help pretty dramatically. But what else is out there for you that is sort of something that we are not doing that we should be taking seriously? Lisa, not to put you on the spot, but since you brought up the Korea story, maybe I'll start with you.
Well, I think the United States has done a number of things. The AUKUS agreement, I think, is a perfect example of strengthening our alliances, our already strong alliances with the UK and with Australia. But the challenge with that one, and I'll just, again, minor vignette, but when you think about it, the challenges with the AUKUS agreement are building fast attacks, and obviously the whole issues that we have are self-imposing issues like ITAR agreements, things like that, or challenges that we've got. We've got to break through those challenges. Well, I'm not saying abrogate, I'm not saying just make them go away and do what, you know, nuclear security be damned. But those kinds of alliances, bringing in, strengthening the U.S., Korea, Japan relationship, that's outward facing. That shows Xi what he doesn't want to see. But being able to strengthen those kinds of alliances. So again, looking at different alliances, the Baltics is another perfect example if you move to the European theater, so to speak. But those relationships, I mean, they're staring Russia right in the face. I mean, we talked this morning, I think it was Frank that had mentioned when we were speaking before this engagement, that Putin has raised the age to 70.
Draft age.
For draft age to 70, and they're also looking to put 20,000 troops on the front facing Sweden and Finland. So, you know, those kinds of things, when you think about that, what does that mean? What does that mean to us? How do we strengthen the relationships and the alliances for those that are right in the backyard? The final thing I'll say is there's another alliance or partnership that's very important to me, near and dear to my heart, and I look to my colleagues to talk about this perhaps, is India. What do you do with the alliances like India? India is in China's backyard. India and the United States have an incredibly strong relationship. However, they have to live there post-China, taking over Taiwan, if you will. Or what are we going to do to ask them? And we obviously have a lot of relationships with them. What are they going to do? Because they are neighbors to China, and they will be there post if China decides to take back Taiwan, or take Taiwan. So, those kinds of things, we have to look at it. Unfortunately, we have to look at it from a regional standpoint, but then we have to look at it from a strategic standpoint, and how do you connect those dots? So those kinds of things, that's nothing new. That's what we've been doing, but we rely on a robust State Department. We rely on a robust defense alliance, if you will, to do all those kinds of things. They're all moving parts, nothing new again, but if not now, when? Because that window is closing on all these different areas. And Xi and Putin are exploiting, and those are just the two. All the other ones are exploiting, the lesser included, if you will, that clearly are coming on, whether it's Iran or whether it's DPRK. They're all coming in and they're all learning from this. And we're allowing that, in some cases, we're allowing that to happen, and we need to stop. And in order to do that, we need a strong, robust deterrent in order to do it, because that, at the end of the day, will be on which we will rely.
Much appreciated. So that point you're getting to at the very end there with the DPRK and Iran actually dovetails perfectly with, frankly, the majority of the questions that came in from the audience, which is effectively, what about all the things that we were told we should be worrying about over the last 20 years, right? So how do we factor in Iran? How do we factor in non-state actors? Where does this kind of fit in the overall story for the commission, but just sort of more broadly with regard to posture? Are we able to sort of walk and chew gum at once with regard to these different types of actors? And I know this is something you all have given quite a lot of thought to in different ways, both in the commission and not. Maybe I'll go to Mara and Rebecca on this one.
Sure. Yes, we have to. And the United States is and should be set up to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Though people have often talked about being in the White House is like playing three-dimensional chess all the time. And that doesn't mean it's not easy. But what I would say is all of the DPRK non-state actors, frankly, all that's playing out in the Middle East right now and the tinderbox that is that region, that is not separate from China as a pacing competitor, Russia as a chronic threat. And the one thing I would kind of amend slightly in what Lisa said is I think you start with the strategy and then you go to the regions. Just like you start with the strategy and you go to what your functional areas are that you need to look at. So I mean, let's just go back to talking about how we thicken our defenses and what is urgent, right? The funding for the supplemental, and I don't mean to kind of keep coming back to it, but I do, because that is the immediate question in front of us. And it shows where these interrelationships are, right? That and I don't discount how much of our resources are involved in that supplemental, which I think is somewhere in the $100 billion range. But that is relatively inexpensive for what we need to do in various ways, for our defense industrial base, and for being able to build that out, for the signs to our allies and partners. Yes, it's money in Ukraine. Yes, it's money in Israel, but it also shows others in that region that we are there and we will be there for them at the same time that we're toughening what we do directly. It strengthens our hand in what we're trying to communicate to Iran in various ways in the region about what they fund and don't fund. And it has money for Taiwan, which is very intentional. So that $100 billion supplemental goes to a strategy that is where the United States should be positioned in the world and how and why it's so important. And that is part of why it just boggles my mind that anyone who cares about the national security of the United States would allow that to sit and not actually move it forward. Because it also goes to when you want the executive branch to be able to do more to strengthen defense, to build out our industrial base. They've got to be really careful about what commitments they make publicly if they don't have a Congress that's going to be able to support it in the end. Because again, the beauty and the challenge of our democracy is you've got to get the three branches of government in one way or another aligned to make stuff actually have a hold and be able to implement. And our allies and partners rely on that. Right. So these are all integrated. It takes a clear strategy and then people who are really good at every day waking up to to Frank's point earlier, and thinking about what they are doing wherever they sit in government. And I would say we need to broaden it to where you sit in industry, where you sit in your communities, to make sure the United States is positioned where and as it needs to be.
Absolutely. Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to kind of answer as quickly as I can do both of your questions, the last one and the one right before it about allies, and then walking and chewing gum at the same time. I mean, when the report talks about how important allies are, I mean, this is not sort of just an academic point that we're making that we just prefer to have allies because allies are nice. What we really mean that we have an enormous opportunity to cooperate and collaborate and take advantage of the knowledge, expertise, real estate, the geography that our allies have in order to do our best to weaken our adversaries and deter our adversaries from acting aggressively against our shared interests. I mean, that is a critical point. So I'll give you a couple practical examples. First of all, too, I want to say whenever I talked about thickening defenses, I meant actually active missile defenses. So not just sort of defenses generically, but we really do need to understand the role that active defenses, missile defenses play in the overall strategic deterrence, not just the threat of offensive retaliation, but also confusing the adversary's calculations, increasing his doubt that his offensive attack would be successful, and then also protecting U.S. assets if, in fact, the adversary does decide to strike so that we have the ability to respond with greater protected capability. So that's what I meant on that particular point, which would be a change in the way the United States thinks about our defense policy for missile defense in our homeland in particular. But the other point is, what else can we do for our allies? I mean, the supplemental, it's got a lot of good stuff for AUKUS in there. I mean, the Australians want us to pass it because we're going to increase our submarines. I mean, our ability to produce, I think, 2 submarines. It's $4 billion specifically for infrastructure to produce submarines faster and more immediately. So there's a lot in there. And when I try to explain it, it's not just that it's $60 billion, quote unquote, for Ukraine. A lot of those capabilities can be used in the China context as well. So though the acute and immediate threat is enabling Ukraine to succeed, we also want to backfill and replenish the stocks of our allies in the region who are willing to buy. And we would much rather them have the best weapons in the world, which are made by American workers, and not getting them from other countries that might have conflicting interests with the United States. And then the other thing is, again, going back to the Australians, or even like the Finns, there's just so many exciting opportunities to collaborate with them, and they're eager to do it, to deter. So I'd love to get some B-21s in Australia. If that's news to the Australians, there you go. But I'd love to park some there, get them in closer to deter our adversaries. I'd love, access to ports that are in there, some access, so refueling opportunities that the United States is going to need because our allies are closer to where these conflicts might begin. I mean, the Finns are going to be an awesome contribution to NATO, and they're up there, it's a notion that we can sort of separate and stovepipe the China threat and the Russia threat regionally. I mean, the Finns and the Estonians are dealing with a broken undersea pipeline that was broken by, it was a Chinese, Hong Kong, Chinese flagged ship with a Russian flagged ship up there in the Baltic Sea, destroyed an undersea cable between Finland and Estonia. So now so there's a China problem in Europe. And so there's increasing opportunities, I think, to bring in our allies in ways that they're eager to play a role. And the United States remains a coalescing force for our allies. So anyway, lots of opportunities on AUKUS. I mean, Pillar 2, I got to talk about Pillar 2, technology sharing. So some of this isn't even big money things that we got to get invested. Some of it's just how can we get out of our own way in terms of being able to share technology with our close allies, UK and Australia, who are very willing to collaborate with the United States.
Fantastic. Frank?
2 points. One, 31 years as a civil servant, I've been taught to stay out of partisan politics. But if we don't start toning down all of the America First isolationist comments that are coming out, we will scare the allies to death. We will set in motion nuclear weapons programs in Korea, Japan, Poland. The last thing the United States needs is to have a proliferation of nuclear powers, even if they are putatively friendly. So very much in our interest to tone this stuff down It's not going to happen until after the election, but it's a major factor every day. The second thing is what can this administration do now? And being very parochial, I think if the administration, instead of studying it, came out and said, yeah, the Strategic Posture Commission got it right, we're going to be adopting that, as I think parts are already happening. When Mara's commission comes out, the same thing, sort of public endorsements. It's nice to have the Defense Department come out with a defense industrial base, but I haven't seen the White House say, yeah, this is my son, I am well pleased in it, right? You know, and what are we doing? I mean, Bill LaPlante's a dear friend, but why haven't the 5 major defense firms been called to the Pentagon and their you know, major sub-suppliers, and give me a plan in 30 days to what you're going to do? I mean, Washington is famous for coming out with policies that don't get implemented, because implementation is hard work, and that's where we are today. I think we need to focus more on getting things done on an urgent basis, as we've all been talking about.
So we're down to about 8 minutes. I want to ask one more question, go down the row with it, answer the question if you want, but also feel free to blow me off if there's something that we have not gotten to that we absolutely had to get to. All right. I've moderated enough panels that I recognize the panelists will blow you off if they want to, and so I'm going to claim that I initiate.
Not you.
But the question is this, and it kind of comes partially from one of the audience observations, which is, you know, the audience observation is latest projections have China losing 40% of its population by 2100, right? And what I want to put out there is that when we look at these two adversaries, the ground is sort of shifting under us in really real time, right? You mentioned that you know, Russia has increased its conscription age to something that is dangerously akin to male life expectancy, right? And probably if they start drafting 70-year-olds, that number will, you know, you get where I'm headed with this. And so these are not actually countries that are necessarily on the upswing. Describing them even as chronic and pacing may actually be a difficult way to think about that. So I'm curious sort of how we factor that into the decision making. That can make them more dangerous. I'm not saying it makes them easier to deal with, but it may make them different to deal with than we had anticipated when we were sort of in earlier iterations of this problem set. And so I sort of wanted to throw that out there for reactions, but as I said, if there are things that we kind of crucially missed, feel free to pass that to your colleagues and pivot. Mara, I'll just kind of go down the row and close it out.
So I worry about the characterization that way as leading to a passivity that I think would be very dangerous. I think it's important whenever, frankly, in any discussions, any negotiations, with somebody who has a different view than you, and it's no different in working with the country, to figure out how they're seeing you and what they want out of it as much as how you see them. And I think in the United States, we have not been particularly strong in our ability to understand what motivates someone who's across the table, and that our motivations are not theirs. And it's a key part of figuring out what the strategy is. And so I say that to say China's clearly going through economic challenges now, population challenges. China has had like a 20-year run on us in terms of strategic planning. And I come back to the economic side of things. I want to pull one thread on something that may seem esoteric, but it goes to what I had mentioned earlier about the lines blurring, you know, across from economic to foreign policy to defense. China has largely cornered the market in the last 20 years on essential minerals. And I say essential minerals because it's both rare earth, critical minerals, the things we need for semiconductors, the things that we need for batteries for our electric vehicles, and for a amount of our weaponry. And when I say corner the market, it's because not only, I mean, they do a certain amount of mining there, but they have controlled the supply chains and they do a tremendous amount of the processing for what's needed. So the United States, our allies and partners, it goes to the AUKUS agreement, are working to try to make up for that. But it's also a place where we need tremendous urgency. And listen, you know, so in the long run, by 2100, we've got a lot of work to do now for us to get to the place where we can maintain our position and build our position in the world by 2100. And, in the long run, we're all dead. I would like to, in my lifetime, maximize what the United States can and should be doing so that future generations are set up for success. And we have a lot of work to do to get there.
Appreciate that. Lisa?
Let me just put a chapeau, if I may, on what Mara, I got back to my bureaucratic speak here, but what Mara said, and that's really, it's a two-pronged approach. It's the near term and it's the strategic thinking. Anybody who, in my opinion, that thinks we can put together a posture 20 to 30 years from now, I think is sadly mistaken, because we saw it in the last posture commission of 2008-2009. China was a lesser included case. What we need to do is be able to do that proverbial walk into chew gum. And I think it's in the United States' best interest to be able to put plans in place now, but not only plans, but execute those plans, because we're not good. It's hard to execute. Well, we need to get to it now, and we need to be able to do it in a two-pronged strategy so we can have the foresight to say, population is important. Obviously, what China's going to look like in 2100. In 2009, we didn't know what they were going to look like in 2023. And if we can't be able to foresee and be able to foresee them in 2 or 3 different options and what they might look like, that's just China. We talked about the 2 adversaries. There are a lot more on the horizon. And so we need to think about, be able to strategize about who those future adversaries might be. That was something that we touched upon in the commission, but it really struck home to me that, China was a lesser included case all but 15 years ago, and where we are today. Who's going to be that next up in the box? And we need to do everything we possibly can to work with ourselves. The United States has to work with our allies and our partners, and those that maybe are emerging partners, to think about strengthening them now so they don't turn into that third adversary, that third nuclear adversary, or the lesser included cases. We need to look at them now, and we need to get our arms around them. And so it's a matter of focusing on China and Russia, but it's also looking at those on the horizon that were not necessarily what we consider to be those. And it goes to the critical materials. It goes to the materials that China's obviously got the advantage on that. They're looking to the African continent. They've pretty much scooped up everything, and they've got them in the economic stronghold. But we need to be able to do that. And I really look to UVA, I look to others, these think tanks, the policy people, to think about those. We're not very good at that these days. We need to grow a whole new generation of minds that can look and strengthen our policies so we can be able to take advantage of history. Those who don't read history are doomed to repeat it. As Frank said, we don't teach history. I think it was Frank that said we don't teach history very often anymore, or do it well. We need to learn from history. So, let's look also, we need to be able to walk and chew gum and look at the over the horizon threats that are just starting to pop up now. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Frank?
I'm tempted to say that what happens in 2100 is going to be the problem for my 2 little grandsons, who will be quite old by that point, so not my problem. I think that what you said points to the danger of the next decade in some. When you have 2 people with messianic visions, Putin and Xi, who see that the end of their life is coming, then and given the trends of which you spoke, there is a built-in drive and determination to do things now while they're still alive, while they still have the resources that they possess. And I think that's why the next 10 years are going to be very perilous. I'm particularly worried about Putin and his dream to put back together the USSR. Xi is somewhat more opaque, I guess, in his policies, but his aim is clear. That China is the dominant force in the Far East, that it owns the South China Sea, that it dominates its neighbors, and as Lisa was saying, that through its vast outreach around the world, it has control of the world's critical mineral resources. So I think that both those trends point to the urgency of doing something now to strengthen our allied relationships and to strengthen our defense and deterrent posture.
Thanks. Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, I would just, to piggyback on that, Mara brought up the point about, or maybe it was, I guess, it was Frank, the one notion that Americans have right now of this America first, sort of inward looking, these are not our problems. That's certainly one particular, I think, problem that we need to contend with. On the other side of the spectrum, there's also this and now it's both. It's actually affecting both at this point. But this idea that that the United States is the one that's causing problems, and that we are the ones that are provoking, and that we actually that our adversaries that there's a failure of understanding. If we could just have more conversations, more dialogue, more diplomacy, that we would get to this understanding. I think that is proven to be a naive idea that Putin has been very clear about what he's trying to do. He's not made it a mystery. You know, when Tucker Carlson started asking him about his aims in Ukraine, he began with Russian history from the 9th century. And I think that we should take that very, very seriously. And it's not just Putin. It's that I tell people, if you try to get rid of Putin, you still have other people there's more Putins after Putin. And so you do have to also appreciate the fact that that there are incompatible national objectives between the United States and Russia, and that Russia does seek to redraw borders based on ethnicity, Russian ethnicity, and historic lands that the Russians believe are rightly theirs, that the United States and the rest of the world does not recognize as theirs. And so that is really important, to understand the adversary as he understands himself, so that the United States does not fall for this mirror imaging, and then we have a collapse of deterrence, because we never really understood what the adversary really wanted. Same applies for Xi Jinping. As Frank said, you know, Americans, I think, are still trying to grapple with the fact that it doesn't make, and we hear this with the current administration sometimes, you know, that the United States and China can continue to rise. Well, that's what we would like to happen. And that's certainly the course that Xi Jinping could have gone down, but he didn't. He made a change, because Marxist-Leninist ideology still plays an enormous role in how Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party thinks about what Chinese interests are. And they reject the notions of a free and open waters for trade and commerce. Totally reject it, never bought into it. But now they have the capability to make good on supplanting the US-led protection of those things that our allies, partners, and even adversaries really benefited from over many years. And so that's the other piece that I would say is just really, really important to get at, is the ideological motivations of our adversaries, to understand them, so that the United States can, and I would just always open for engagement when it suits U.S. interests. And so that's the other thing with the report, is we say this is not a optimistic outlook for arms control in moving into this new era, because both of our major power adversaries have simply rejected it and actually believe that these things undermine their interests. And so which is really important to keep in mind.
I think that's a fantastic way to close this conversation. It is, we could obviously go on for another 2 hours here, but the fun will continue. We have another panel this afternoon, or not this afternoon, immediately after this. Please stick with us for that. And then an exciting keynote address from former Vice Chairman General John Hyten to close us out. So do stick with us. But in the meantime, please join me in thanking this fantastic panel. This has been incredible.